The lead pastor here. Welcome to everybody on Zoom. Thanks for joining us. Today we're in a sort of bit of a transition. It's a holiday weekend, obviously, so happy holiday, Labor Day weekend to everyone. And it's sort of transition in a sense from our summer schedule over to our fall schedule. It's back to school time, all that kind of thing. So today's a little bit of a transition Sunday for us. We're actually going to look at a little story in Luke's Gospel, which we'll read in a minute. It's just a short passage. And in some sense, we're looking back a little bit because you may remember we did actually go through the whole of the book of Luke earlier this year, in two different sections. We had part one and part two. And then also, we've just finished a series called Elemental Spirituality, where we were looking at the elements, water, wind, fire, and earth. And we were sort of, looking at those elements as a way of trying to experience God in different ways. And the story today has two of those elements in it. It's the elements of earth being grounded, which we're going to talk about foundations, and then also water and the kind of storm of life that can happen to us at times. So in some sense, we're looking back, and also we're kind of looking ahead a little bit because we're going to start a new series next week called Why I Follow Jesus. And we're going to kind of, we often do this during the fall time, is sort of re-examine our vision, why we're following Jesus, what following Jesus means, and sort of re-engage and reaffirm our commitment. So I think this passage today kind of helps us a little bit with that. It's going to bring up some of those kind of issues. Let's jump right in there. Maybe see if we can put the story up. I think most people, I think, will have heard this story. It's a very well-known story. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. They are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on the rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house, but could not shake it because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed and its destruction was complete. So this might be a story we heard when we were kids. If we used to go to church when we were kids, there's a famous song about it. It's generally viewed as a children's story. And if you go online and look up I was trying to find videos that might depict this story, and they're all really young age kids videos, which probably wouldn't have been appropriate for sophisticated thinkers like us, right? So, but the reality is, I think this is far from a simple story, and hopefully we'll be able to unpack this a little bit. What I want to do today is look at it in its literary context. It's a story that Jesus tells, so it's a story, so it's literature. We'll look at it in that respect and sort of unpack that a little bit. We'll then look at it in the context of the Bible, so the biblical context. And of course, the Bible that Jesus had at the time was the Hebrew Scriptures, so what as Christians often call the Old Testament. So we're going to just look at how it fits there, because there's some allusions to other parts of the Hebrew Scriptures. Then we'll sort of bring it back into Jesus's day again and look at the socio-political, religious context of this story. And then we'll bring it into our day and think about how can we apply this into our own lives? What does this really mean to us? And how can it transform us? How can it change us? Okay, so the story let's think about where it appears. It comes in Luke at the very end of what's called the Sermon on the Plain. That's a part of Luke that contains a lot of Jesus' most famous teaching, stuff about turning the other cheek, loving your enemies, not judging others, taking the log out of your own eye, etc. A lot of that teaching comes in what's called the Sermon on the Plain. Now, it's similar to what's called the Sermon on the Mount, and Hannah referenced that at the beginning of the service, which is in Matthew's Gospel, and it's much more extensive. But again, this story comes right at the end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel. So the fact that Jesus ends this really important teaching of his about how to live life, or at least the authors end their collection of Jesus's teaching that's so important with this parable, with this story, suggests a couple of things. One, it's really important, all right, to end off that sermon, both of those sermons, both of those teachings this way means this is an important story. And secondly, I think it gives us some context that Jesus isn't talking in general terms, like, oh, do what I say. But it's talking very specifically about this teaching that he's just given, which is about living life in a radical new way, this new kingdom way that Jesus was talking about. So it's in Matthew, it's in Luke. Let's think about that for a moment, because the stories are actually slightly different. Now, we've said many times before, the author of Matthew and the author of Luke are almost certainly drawing on the earliest written gospel, which is Mark. That's, most scholars would agree on that, not everybody. So large sections of Matthew and Luke are almost word for word the same as sections of Mark, big sections of Mark. But they also have their own material from other sources, Matthew and Luke, and they seem to also draw on another common source, which we've never discovered. It may have been an oral tradition, it may have been a written down document that's been lost. But the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, the content of many of the sayings of Jesus in those two sermons, one in Matthew, one in Luke, seem to have been drawn from the same document, but they use them in different ways. And Luke it uses this story differently to how Matthew uses it. In Matthew, which is what the famous song is based on, it's about the wise and the foolish man, right? So the wise man builds his house upon the rock. The foolish man builds his house on the sand. It's about choices. There's rock over there, there's sand here. The wise person's going to make a good choice. In Luke's account, Jesus says the person who's obedient is the one who digs down and builds a foundation on rock, as opposed to building a foundation without digging down to the rock. In other words, the way Luke ends this teaching is to say, doing what I say, not just hearing, but doing, which is what Jesus is getting at here at the beginning of the story, is done by effort. It's hard work. In other words, it's not just about a wise or a foolish choice. It's we put these teachings into practice by digging, by doing the hard work. So that's how Luke is framing this. And I think as we see, that leads to perhaps a slightly different application of the teachings of Jesus. And the people of that day would have understood how much hard work was involved in building a house. So the houses in first century Palestine were built during the summertime, because in the winter it would rain a lot. Sometimes there was snow. And that meant that the soil was really hard. It was very clay-like soil, baked hard. And that meant a couple of things. One, in the summertime, one was if you were going to build a house, it's a heck of a lot of hard work to dig down through that hard soil. And secondly, it would be really tempting in the summer to think, this is a pretty firm foundation. I can build on this. The only problem would be if you didn't dig down, and it depends how much digging was required. It would depend where the house was. So if you're in the valleys, it might be digging down 10 feet or more. If you're in the uplands, sometimes the rock faces were exposed, so you wouldn't have to dig much at all. But if you're in certain areas, you'd have to dig down quite far. And what that would mean is if you dug down and you built the foundation on the rock, when the rains eventually come in the winter, that house would not be washed away. Whereas if you'd built on the very hard, firm foundation of the clay soil, eventually the rain would soften that soil up and the house would be washed away. The mortar would break. They use mud for mortar, and the house would be washed away. And it may well be, we don't know for sure, but that people listening would have seen houses fall down like that. There are cases even in present day Israel where houses have just they haven't dug far enough. Even apartment blocks where they didn't dig deep enough, and there was they subsided and eventually collapsed. So that's what Jesus is talking about, doing the hard work. And that was kind of a graphic example for the people of his day. So this is the story that we're dealing with, and it's told in a particular way. As I said, it's a story, so there's a poetic form to this story. Stories were told in a certain kind of way and written down in a certain kind of way. It kind of made them more memorable, perhaps. And this is a case of step parallelism, which I can never say that word. This is pretty obvious, really. Okay, so there's two sections to the story that are parallel to each other. There's the first one, which is hear my words and do them. And that's like a person who builds on a foundation. When the flood comes, the house stands. And then that's repeated. A person who hears, but in this case doesn't do. They build, but there's no foundation. When the flood comes, the house falls. So it's told in this memorable fashion. And the point of step parallelism is that the climax is the important thing. So here, the storm is the climax, the flood, the house falling down, that's the climax. That's not that the other points aren't important, but Jesus is leading up to a storm is coming. And if you remember from when we were looking at the Gospel of Luke in more detail, repeatedly Jesus weeps over Jerusalem, weeps over the people of Israel, warns the people of Israel that a storm is coming, which we now know historically was the overthrow of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple by the Romans due to a rebellion by the Jews. And Jesus was foreseeing this and warning people. So this is a story about a storm coming. It's not like, if you get into difficulties, here's some helpful advice. It's almost like Jesus is saying, perhaps socially, expect upheaval, and perhaps even personally, in our personal lives, expect upheaval. And the way to stand in that upheaval is to do the hard work of digging a foundation. And that foundation is based on this teaching about turning the other cheek, about not judging, about loving our enemies. It's this kingdom teaching of Jesus. Okay, so that's a little bit of the literary context. As I mentioned, this parable alludes to other parts of the Hebrew scriptures, and in particular, a passage in Isaiah. So let's look at that. Isaiah was a Hebrew prophet prophesying in the 7th century BCE, so 700 to 800 years before Jesus, so a long time before Jesus. And the prophet's writings are in the Hebrew scriptures, and Jesus would have been very familiar with those, and possibly his listeners would be familiar with those, and certain stories in the Hebrew scriptures particularly would have been very familiar, and this may well be one of them. So this is from Isaiah 28. We'll just read it through, then we'll sort of unpack it a little bit. Therefore, hear the word of the Lord, you scoffers who rule this people in Jerusalem. You boast, we have entered into a covenant with death, with the realm of the dead. We have made an agreement. When an overwhelming scourge sweeps by, it cannot touch us. For we have made a lie our refuge and falsehood our hiding place. So this is what the sovereign Lord says. See, I lay a stone in Zion, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation. The one who relies on it will never be stricken with panic. I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the plumb line. Hail will sweep away our refuge. The lie and water will overflow your hiding place. Your covenant with death will be annulled. Your agreement with the realm of the dead will not stand. When the overwhelming scourge sweeps by, you will be beaten down by it. Okay, so we actually have here another literary form. It gets called different things, but it's a chiasm. It's a symmetry. So it's like where the first point and the last point correspond to each other, and then there's a turning point in the middle. And the turning point for this is they will not be panic-stricken. In other words, it's the same kind of thing of you will stand in the flood, you stand in the storm. And you can see some similar language here. There's talk about storms or scourges and things being swept away, and the need for a foundation, a precious foundation stone. So there's similarities here. But let's look at a little bit of the context. You may have noticed, again, at the beginning and the end, because there's symmetry here, there's talk about making an alliance with death and Sheol and the underworld and that kind of thing. And this is a reference to the nation of Egypt. The Egyptians' cult of the dead was very much central to their theology, to their religious practice. Hence mummification and worship of Osiris, who you traveled into the underworld and into the world of the dead, and there was this other life out there. So this is a reference to Egypt. Now, to get some of the context for that, let's think a little bit about the history. And maybe we can put that first map up. Thanks, Steve. Great. So here's the Eastern Mediterranean. So this is sort of Israel, the nation of Israel, which a few hundred years before had split into two: the northern kingdom, which was still called Israel, and the southern kingdom, which was called Judah. Isaiah is prophesying from Judah, okay, and Jerusalem is its capital. The capital of Israel is Samaria. This whole area became Samaria eventually in Jesus, or most of that area became Samaria in Jesus' time. But this is, 8 centuries before Jesus. So here's the northern kingdom now, and here's Egypt down here. The dominant empire at that time was the Assyrian Empire, and I think we can look at the next map here. So, and you can see, man, these guys kind of ruling, and they were really violent, quite vicious in battle, and really, didn't take many prisoners. They would deport people, but they killed people in all kinds of atrocious ways, and sort of wrote about it, thinking, magnifying it, because they thought it was an example of their great power. But you can see here that they are governing pretty much the whole of this area, with the exception of part of Judah down here. And so what had happened is in 1720, the northern kingdom of Israel had fallen to, this is all BCE, so 720 BCE, the northern kingdom had fallen to the Assyrians, and they were now breathing down the neck of Judah, the southern kingdom. And in fact, at the time that Isaiah is prophesying, Jerusalem, they've laid siege to Jerusalem. The Assyrians have laid siege to Jerusalem, and what the people of Judah, the ruling king of Judah, had done is formed an alliance with Egypt to help protect him against the Assyrians. And Isaiah is saying and prophesying, saying, look, you think you're safe because you've made this allegiance, because you've made this alliance. But Isaiah, throughout the book, is saying, and throughout all his prophecies, is saying, trust in God, trust in the way of life of God, if you like, the way of justice, the way of what the Hebrews would call shalom, the way of love and forgiveness and acceptance and peace and harmony. And the reason that you're in so much trouble is because you haven't been following that way. There's injustice, and we saw that in that passage. Where actually it's sort of referenced because it's looking ahead, saying one day there will be justice, implying there isn't justice now. And they're saying you're making an alliance with Egypt, which is kind of like making an alliance with death. And if you remember, the passage starts with Isaiah saying, hear you scoffers, hear God's word, you scoffers. A little bit like Jesus saying, hear my words, but do them. But he references scoffers, but then sort of turns it on its head and makes fun of them, saying, why would you make an alliance with death? Don't you want life? This life that God is offering, the way of God is a way of life and brings healing and hope and salvation ultimately. But you're just trusting in death with this alliance with Egypt. So there's this foundation. They use that, Isaiah uses that term. This foundation based on Egypt, based on death, is going to be washed away. But there's a future hope, another foundation. So again, we have two foundations, right? This future foundation is a precious cornerstone or a gemstone. Its plumb line is righteousness. It's based on justice. In other words, it's not all doom and gloom. You will be washed away. That seems to be what Isaiah is implying. And in fact, this little place called Babylon here, the Babylonians eventually overthrew the Assyrians, and they had the privilege of sacking Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and carried the Ark of the Covenant, which was this treasured possession of the people of Israel, where they believed God resided, the presence of God resided. They carried the Ark of the Covenant off, and it has never been found again. Well, apart from Indiana Jones, he nearly got it, but we don't know where that is anymore. They don't know where it is anymore. That's kind of significant. We'll come back to that in a second. But they were washed away and taken off into exile in Babylon, many of them. But there's this future hope. There's this future hope. Now, let's go back into Jesus' day. So we're going to jump ahead, 8 centuries or so, back to Jesus' time, and think, okay, why would Jesus allude to that story when he's telling this story about the two foundations? And some of that has to do with the socio-political, the religious context of the day. Jesus seems to be challenging various groups who are kind of vying for people's attention, vying for power, perhaps, vying for being perhaps that future hope, that precious stone, that precious foundation. So let's look at who are the sort of competing elements in Jewish culture at that time. And we have these four groups: the Pharisees, the Zealots, the Essenes, and then I've sort of bracketed several under just the heading the temple, people who are kind of in one way or another associated with the temple. Let's think about the Pharisees. We're kind of familiar with the Pharisees, right? And if you read the Gospel of Luke, as we did, the Pharisees are coming up all the time, and often it's in this context of conflict. Jesus is very frequently in conflict with them. But the Pharisees are based in the synagogues out in the countryside. In Galilee, where Jesus is speaking these words, his home region, and also in Judea, further south, what Judah became known as. And So they're out in the country. They're sort of the everyday people, if you like. And their foundation is the law, Torah, and perfect application of the law, absolute following of every single letter of the law. It's as though they want to attain perfection, and that's the future hope. That's the future foundation. If we were just religiously perfect, if we followed every rule there is, God would be pleased with us and everything will be fine. And Jesus, though, challenges them, as we've seen repeatedly, by saying, look, that's just skin deep. You know, it's not about following the letter of the law. It's about being transformed from the inside out. And you're just following law on the outside, but he talks frequently about, but your hearts are dark. And, you know, the fruit that you bear is not good. It's not kind. It's not loving. It's hateful. It's critical. He talks in this passage in the Sermon on the Plain about having a plank in your own eye, a log in your own eye, where you kind of see the other person as less than you, and perhaps dehumanize them because they're not good enough, they're not perfect enough, and you sort of take the higher ground. He's constantly criticizing the Pharisees about this, right? Criticizing, if you like, that foundation. So having just talked about that, it's not hard to imagine that this talk about foundation could be applied to the Pharisees, like challenging that foundation. Another group is the Zealots, and the Zealots were a political group. They were actually based also in Galilee. That's where they evolved, and they were a group that their foundation was power through violence. They advocated violent overthrow of the Roman Empire, that are the dominating force at the time of Jesus. And they actually, they led a bunch of different fightbacks against the Romans, and then eventually they led the Great Jewish Revolt after the time of Jesus, which ended with Rome sacking Jerusalem, destroying the temple again. It's like history repeating itself. And Jesus is saying in this passage again, in this Sermon on the Mount, forgive your enemies, love your enemies, turn the other cheek. Jesus is advocating non-violence, not in a passive kind of way. Let's stay again, and there's not enough time to dig into that. We've done that before and we'll do it again, I'm sure. But Jesus is saying violence is not the way. Violence begets violence. If the foundation is violence, you're going to get swept away, because there will always be a bigger empire. There will always be a bigger bully. There will always be somebody else who's going to out-violence you. This isn't the way of the foundation has to be love, not violence. So Jesus is challenging the Zealots. The Essenes. The Essenes were a group, a sort of elitist, monastic, reclusive community that lived out in the desert near the Dead Sea. And they were probably around an area called Qumran, but what's called Qumran today, which is actually where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found last century, or actually still some being found now. But scrolls that were hidden away in caves that this community, the Essenes, probably cared for or looked after. Lots of ancient literature and ancient biblical literature as well, that they preserved. And so that's kind of a little bit of how we know about this community from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Their foundation was elitism, if you like. It was mystical, apocalyptic elitism. They felt like by withdrawing to the desert, separating themselves from the unclean world and just becoming perfect, that would usher in an apocalypse where Israel's enemies would be defeated and the truth would be told, and they would be raised up as the chosen people of God, and they would have the power. And they advocated withdrawal from society. Now, interestingly, as we think about that prophecy from Isaiah, there's one of the scrolls that we've discovered recently, you know, in the last few decades, is one called the community rule. There's various ways of translating it, but the community rule. And it seems to be the rule for life that this Essene community had for themselves. And in there is a part where it says that there will be three priests and 12 men, of course, it would be men, who will form this perfect council. And they will perfectly apply the law, the Torah. They will perfectly know how to live. They will have perfect wisdom, and that will usher in the end. And that council is called a precious stone, or it says it's a precious stone, a precious foundation. That language is used. It's not hard to believe that that community, that's community way of interpreting the Isaiah passage that we just read. And so when Jesus talks about foundation, you imagine that at that time, that is a direct challenge to the Essenes. In other words, Jesus saying, look, it's not about withdrawal. I mean, if you really think about the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, and the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is not advocating withdrawal from life. Jesus is advocating engagement in life, in real life, which means you need to forgive people, you need to love people, you need to get over yourself, you have to stop judging people. If we take the account in Matthew's Gospel of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, be salt and light, be mixed in with real life, which is messy and difficult and hard. Don't withdraw from it. There's a way through this. There's a way of living this out in life. There's a new foundation that can be built that is in real life. Jesus seems to be challenging the Essenes. And then finally, we have the temple group. And this is a bit of a hodgepodge of people that I'm going to put, of groups I'm going to put in this category. But you've got the Sadducees, who are this financial, religious elite, very closely associated with the temple. Jesus has a few run-ins with them, and not as much as with the Pharisees. It's the priests who Jesus eventually has a major run-in with. The priesthood are the ones who run the temple. They're an elite group. You couldn't be a priest unless you were born into certain families. And then also let's say the Herodians, the Herod entourage. The Herods were puppet kings that the Romans put in place to govern. So all these people really are in cahoots with the Romans. They're cooperating with the Romans. The Herodians or Herod financed a lot of the rebuilding of the temple that the Babylonians had destroyed. So this is in Jesus' time. It's the second temple that's been rebuilt, and then eventually gets destroyed again by the Romans. It's like a tragic story. So this group's foundation, they're based around the temple. That's their location, if you like. Metaphorically and literally in the case of the priests. But their foundation is privilege. Their foundation is wealth and control and power, and they maintain that power by cooperating with Rome. And Jesus is constantly challenging the temple, and we see that especially as Jesus eventually gets to Jerusalem. When he's telling this story that we're looking at, he's still out in Galilee, but by the time he gets to Jerusalem, he's challenging the temple and saying the temple's going to fall, seemingly predicting the overthrow of Jerusalem by Rome. And they hate him for the sort of stuff he says about the temple. But Jesus is saying to them, look, you're blind. Your privilege is blinding you. You have this false sense of comfort. You think you're in cahoots with Rome. You think everything's going to be okay. You can manipulate power and enjoy wealth while others are suffering. It's blinding you. Your privilege is blinding you to reality. And Jesus is challenging that foundation. Again, interestingly, we know this from the Mishnah. The Mishnah are sort of commentaries, probably initially oral commentaries that eventually got written down a few centuries after Jesus, commentaries on the Hebrew scriptures. And from the Mishnah, we have stories that when the Ark of the Covenant, going back to that, when the Babylonians destroyed the temple and took away the Ark, we don't know where, when the Ark was taken and lost, that it was replaced with a stone, and sort of symbolizing the Ark, which itself was meant to be where God resided, the presence of God. And that stone was called the foundation. It was just that's the name it had. So it may well be, and that's as much evidence as we have, but it may well be that Jesus's critique of the temple group is not just in what he says directly about the temple, but him talking about a foundation. And what kind of foundation are you building could be an allusion to the temple cult, to the absolute belief that the temple and God, the fact that we kind of own God, is the foundation, that future hope that Isaiah was talking about. So Jesus seems to be challenging all these groups. Now, I don't think Jesus is standing up here. It would be kind of crazy if this was the case, if Jesus is standing up saying, you are all wrong, that's at least 4 of you are wrong, but I'm right, and sort of preaching a new kind of elitism. I don't think that's what Jesus is doing here, just pull people down. I think what he's saying is, look, this isn't about being perfect. This isn't about being privileged. This isn't about being elite and sort of mystical and somehow holier than thou. This isn't about fighting. Jesus is leveling the playing field, saying, this is for everybody. Everybody can dig. Everybody can follow my words. And everybody can not follow them. Everybody can hear and not do. But everybody, if they're willing to do the work, can forgive their enemies, can turn the other cheek, can stop judging others, can build a new community that Jesus called the kingdom of God. And it's for everyone. Everyone's included in that. It's not about elitism. It's not about privilege. Doesn't matter what family you were born into. Doesn't matter whether you're male, female. Doesn't matter who you are. Everyone gets to participate in this. I think that's what Jesus is saying. So he's criticizing the ways in which these other movements really ultimately are destructive or exclusive. So just as we wrap up here, we'll in a second, we'll move into a time of communion. Let's just think about coming back to our own lives. So this is sort of the 4th phase. We've looked at it in its literary context. We looked at it in its biblical, historical context. We've looked at it in its socio-political context and religious context. Now let's think about our own context. How can we dig a new foundation? Or perhaps we it's not necessarily new for us, but how do we shore up that foundation? And let's just reflect on these things. Because in a moment we'll have communion together, which is a time when we identify with Jesus, right? We identify with the sacrifice that Jesus made and the willingness to love, the willingness to absolutely love. So let's think as we come to that time about what particular challenges might we be facing. And I don't think any of these will feel new, but that's part of the problem, I think, is that we get familiar with what Jesus is saying, familiar with the teaching that is actually incredibly radical, incredibly challenging, and it can just sort of escape us a little bit. And again, Jesus is saying, hear and do. In other words, let's dig that foundation. So a question for us would be, are we practicing nonviolence? And let's think about this in the context of a storm is coming. That might sound all doom and gloom, but we could think about it, we all go through personal storms, right? We also are going through social storms. I don't know whether we're going to go through a storm like the people of Israel went through, or the people of Jesus later on after Jesus' day went through. But we live in very unstable times, right? We live in internally in our own nation and around the world. We live in very uncertain times. And I would imagine we're all a little bit more nervous about life than we were 10 years ago. I don't know, but probably we are, because the world seems a very unstable place, a stormy place, if you like. And it's very easy, I think, in that context to not practice non-violence. I mean, we might not go out and beat somebody up, but in the way we engage, in the way we talk, you just think about how interaction happens on social media in with such a polarized context that we live in. Are we practicing non-violence in the way we speak, in the way we conduct ourselves, in the way we look at other people? And also part of this, I think, is in the way of Jesus, is are we challenging violence, physical violence, emotional violence, violence through language? Are we challenging that when we see it? It's not just about not doing, it's about what we don't do and what we do, right? So that might be something we want to reflect on. How, in what way are we really embodying what Jesus talked about? In what way are we digging that foundation rather than just hearing it and saying, yeah, I really admire Jesus. What a guy, as opposed to, okay, that's a call to live a certain way. Letting go of comfort and privilege. Jesus seemed to be saying that comfort and privilege blinds us from reality, and that's part of the problem. If the privilege we have in all sorts of different ways, and it's different for each of us, can blind us from the needs of other people, can blind us from another person's situation. What are we doing to cross the road, if you like? What are we doing to live in somebody else's skin, live in somebody else's shoes, and to actively listen and engage with other people to hear the cry of their heart rather than just dismiss it as whatever reason give for dismissing it because we're not experiencing that pain, we're not experiencing that situation ourselves. Is that the challenge we need to face this morning? And again, that could be socially in a political way, if you like. It might be personally in relationships with people that we're where we perhaps have more power than somebody else in a relationship, and that leads us perhaps to not necessarily try to empathize with them as much as we could do. Taking the log out of our own eye. In what way? This would be the Pharisees, right? In what way do we look down on people or even dehumanize other people and think of ourselves as fundamentally we're better than other people? And if any of us, I think, say, myself included, we've never thought that, we're probably lying, right? That it's very easy to look down on people, and it's very easy. We might not think that perhaps we're perfect or we're infallible or we're these knees, but we certainly can think, I'm better than that person, right? So this is in the heart of all of us. And Jesus is saying to the Pharisees and saying to us, take the log out of your own eye. Don't dehumanize somebody. Don't judge another person. I mean, if we could go around not judging, how different would life be in society and in our relationships, in our personal life? And there may be a situation where we know we're resentful, we're judgmental, we're looking down on another person. That may be where the challenge of this story is for us today as we dig a new foundation. And then being the change we want to see in the world. This is, I think, what Jesus might say to the Essenes. It's don't just withdraw and hope for the best, like in some utopia. I mean, and let's face it, don't you ever feel like that? Don't you just want to? I mean, I frequently think I don't want to ever look at the news again. I just want to sort of hunker down in my own house with the people I like around me, and there's 2 or 3, well, that like me as well. No, you know what I mean. We just hunker down and just block it all out and hope it goes away. And I think Jesus is saying it's not going to go away. A storm is coming, right? So that's the whole climax of this story. And storms aren't because we failed; they aren't judgment. They're not because we've done something wrong. I mean, they can be sometimes, but it's just what happens. And Jesus is saying to stand, you need to dig a foundation. And I think that's about us being the change we want to see in the world, engaging in the world with its mess, with its horror, with its the smells of the world, of the difficulties we encounter bringing about change, the difficulties we encounter in other people, and then the difficulties we encounter in ourselves because of our inadequacies. Those are all real when we engage. And Jesus is saying, that's what I'm calling you to. I'm not calling you to perfection. I'm not calling you to be perfect before you step out. This isn't about who's the best. This is about who's willing to love, who's willing to forgive, who's willing to turn the other cheek, who's willing to take the log out of their own eye. The teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Plain, teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. So as we take communion this morning, let's reflect on these questions and what might be most relevant to us. The band will be playing a few songs, a couple of songs, and you might just want to sit and listen or just spend a little bit of time in meditation. Come to the front and grab some gluten-free crackers and fruit juice, or at the middle there. You can have it with somebody else, take it with somebody else, or just go back to your seat. We also have candles you can light at the back that might just reflect your own prayer and connection to God. We have prayer stations under Grow and Journey. You can write a prayer out there and just put it in the window, leave it there. People will pray for you during the week, or you may not want somebody to pray for you. You just want to write that prayer out yourself. That's great too. Got a station at the back there for Ukraine, where you can pray and cry out to God. And this is a time where we just really respond in the way that seems fit for us. So let's just pray, and then we'll take communion together. Lord Jesus, thank you for your courage, for your heart, for your compassion. You know where we're coming from, and you are calling us to build a foundation, to dig deep. Not out of judgment, but because you want us to stand. You want us to be a people that can embody love, embody your kingdom. So move within us now. Just come alongside us and show us where we need to change, what we need to do. We pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.